Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the Dirk Ippen lecture. I'm particularly happy to greet Dirk. It is not always that the gentleman or the lady who gave the name for a lecture is present, and Dirk, we love to have you. We had a little gathering a short while ago, and there they distributed these coasters. It's very attractive. It shows Securitas. She is half naked, more than half naked, quite naked, as a matter of fact. Very appealing, very appealing. So Securitas is clearly very appealing. It is clearly from a Roman coin. But I was interested that even the Romans were drinking Warnsteiner. that was a completely new thing for me. My function at these meetings, other than welcoming you, which I do with great pleasure, is to introduce the introducer, because we have established a tradition at the Academy, which I think is a wonderful tradition, that our fellows should ideally be introduced by somebody from the Berlin or German scene. Professor Geulen, who will introduce Michèle, is very well known. She is the director of the Center for Cultural and Scholarly History. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. I'm on the wrong. That's her professorship at Humboldt University. She is actually the director of the Center for Literary and Cultural Research. And before she came to Berlin, before she was one to come here, she was a professor at Frankfurt, and before that she was a professor at Bonn, and before that she was for many years a professor at NYU, where I think the two of you met. Now, I pointed out to Professor Geulen that when I have the task of introducing somebody whom I do not know, and I did not know her before tonight, I always look at a resume and look at what has the person in common, what do she have in common. And I discovered three elements. I told her two of those, but I kept the third as a surprise. The two elements, slender reads, I have to say, are that Professor Geulen was a student at the University of Freiburg, where Regina and I also were students, though she was after our time a student there. And then, of course, being kind of Stanford-centric, I discovered that from 1989 to 1990, Professor Geulen was a visiting assistant professor of German literature at Stanford University. And I'm happy to report that she said at dinner tonight that this was the happiest year of her life. Didn't surprise me, of course, as you understand, right? but there it is. Now comes the third element, and that's the weightier one. Professor Geulen did her doctoral dissertation at Johns Hopkins University about Adalbert Stifter. Now, he is a German author whom very few Germans read, and even fewer Americans. But I am one of those. I have read virtually all of Stifter, and so I was immensely pleased that you did your doctoral dissertation about this otherwise so very obscure, but in many ways incredibly good writer. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Geulen.
Thank you very much. It is always good to find a fellow Stifter reader, and you will forgive me when I correct you that he's not a German writer, but an Austrian writer. And just because we are We are among philologists. I also have to correct that I said the happiest. I said one of the happiest years of my life was at Stanford University, which is not hard because Stanford was a great place. So thank you for your very, very friendly introduction. Dear President Caspar, dear fellows, and dear guests, it is a great honor and a true pleasure to introduce tonight's highly distinguished speaker, who also happens to be a good friend, Professor Michèle Lowrie, Andrew Mellon Professor of Classics at the University of Chicago, and currently Dirk Ippendorf Fellow here at the American Academy in Berlin. After an undergraduate education at Yale, Michèle received her PhD in classical philology in 1990 from Harvard University. She joined the classics department at New York University in 1990 and received tenure there in 1996. In 2009, Michèle joined the University of Chicago, where she was appointed Andrew Mellon Professor in 2015 and currently serves as Deputy Dean of the Humanities. She is also a much sought-after fellow, so the American Academy is very lucky to have her, both in the US and in Europe. Her visiting appointments here include fellowships at the Center for Advanced Studies in Munich, the Cluster of Excellence in Konstanz, and the Warburg House in Hamburg. Michèle is a Latinist and world-renowned expert on Horace. His narrative odes were the subject of her first book, which appeared with Oxford University Press in 1997. A subsequent book, entitled Writing, Performance, and Authority in Augustan Rome, also with Oxford Press, appeared in 2009. Currently, she's working together with Barbara Finken, who's also here tonight, Barbara, on a book dealing with the figure of civil war from antiquity through the 19th century. In addition, she has edited several volumes on a broad number of subjects and published numerous articles on questions of classical philology and beyond. And beyond. That is, I believe, among the defining features of Michèle's work as a classicist. In all of her scholarship, she engages subsequent developments up to and including recent political concerns and recent theoretical work. In her publications, one not only encounters Horace and Virgil, Cicero and Ovid, but also Freud and Benjamin, Derrida and Agamben, as well as a host of writers and poets from various national traditions, particularly, but not exclusively, from the Romagna. But I add, even if she hasn't read Stifter, her German and is very well, and her knowledge of German literature as well. This expansive horizon, and I might add, the correlating expertise across boundaries and disciplines, is less a function of seeking to enrich the classical tradition, because the classical tradition does not need any enrichment, but on the contrary, Michèle evokes this horizon to remind us where our modernities have come from. As she once put it in a paper a long time ago, and I quote, "Literature is a Latin word," unquote. Indeed, authority, example, and exception, foundation, and translation are also Latin words, and each one of them has played a very important role in Michèle's scholarly pursuits. In fact, the sequence of nouns circumscribes the ways in which we, willingly, knowingly, or not, relate to Rome, because it was in those terms that Rome related to itself. As Hannah Arendt, among others, has shown, Michèle continues to remind us Roman concepts, tropes, and figures have shaped not only our understanding of literature, but also of law and politics in a way that we are often only dimly aware of. To us as modernists, to me as a modernist, Michèle's work on the persistent latency, and yes, Latinitas is a Latin word too, the persistent latency of Rome in our cultures is a precious resource and an inspiring reminder that we do not own the tropes, figures, and concepts we employ to make sense of our current world. In this respect, I have learned far more from Michèle than from many of my colleagues in the modern philologies. And one of my fondest memories and most enriching experiences, other than Stanford, is team teaching with Michèle at NYU. A large undergraduate class on wild women in drama from antiquity to the 20th century, and another one entitled Conversations of the West, where we paired texts from antiquity with modern texts. Exodus in the Bible with Marx on the Jewish question, Lucretius' De Rerum Naturae with Darwin, Sophocles' Oedipus with Freud. I do not know how much the students learned, but I certainly profited enormously. Michèle's subject matter for today is once again a Latin word, rich and fraught with acute resonances. A recent Google search of Securitas yielded as first result a company of that name with 3 offices in Berlin alone. Securitas, the company, not the half-naked woman, promises or threatens, I quote, to incorporate systems, people, and equipment into high-performing security solutions, unquote. To be sure, there could hardly be a topic more appropriate or more pressing today, as protection of borders and security of citizens have taken center stage and are pitched against the rights and freedoms of citizens and refugees alike in a way we have not seen since the aftermath of 9/11. Hence, it is all the more important to learn now what Michèle has to teach us about security as a Roman metaphor. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lowrie.
So thank you very much, Eva. Brings back old times. Here at the American Academy, they treat us really with the kind of luxury that I am unaccustomed to. And in return, they expect us to be diplomats. And so I feel that I'm a diplomat in 3 senses. Our job here is to show that Americans are not necessarily like the characters you might read of in the media, particularly these days. So I'm a diplomat from America to Germany. I also feel that I'm a diplomat from antiquity to modernity, which you will hear more about. But there's another way in which I feel that I'm a diplomat, which is that I have been very strongly formed and I will now use a Latin word coming through French in the sense of a formation from the German intellectual scene. And there are a number of people here in the audience, including Eva, who have taught me. So that means that I feel that I'm also a diplomat from a German way of thinking, which I bring back to the States and my discipline in the States. Okay, here we go. Security is a metaphor. English security derives from Latin, but the word has roamed far beyond its original meaning. First attested in Cicero's philosophical works, Securitas originally meant peace of mind in a psychological sense. By the time of Velleius Paterculus, writing under Tiberius just under a century later, it has transferred to the empire, Securitas Imperii Romani, the security of the Roman Empire. During this period, its meaning comes to approximate our modern national security. That is, security passes from its proper sphere in psychology to the improper sphere of politics. And it has now passed so many boundaries that one can no longer speak of a proper or an improper for this word. But we're going to go back to the beginning. As a metaphor on its way to conceptualization, security has a history, and its emergence does some form of work. Starting about a decade before Cicero's death, let's say the year of Ovid's birth in 43 BCE, its meaning grows and stabilizes into a regular constellation of tropes by the time Ovid dies, a few years after Augustus in 17 CE. Between Cicero and Velleius, over the course of Ovid's lifetime, civil war destroys the Roman Republic, and Rome reconfigures in a new imperial form. A host of interrelated strands coalesce in the Roman political imaginary and produce a new way of thinking about physical safety, the quality of a citizen's attachment to politics, the leader's duties to preserve the state, and the state's not just to guard the safety of its people, but also to provide collective peace of mind. Security was forged in the conceptual crucible of political collapse and rebirth. By transferring philosophy's valorization of tranquility in the soul to the sphere of politics, the metaphor justifies suppressing contestation in favor of peace. Civil war made the stakes of Republican contestation too high, too threatening to the blessed life. A new politics of Securitas was the answer. So why should we care today about the background of a concept that has long left its origins behind? As security has come to permeate all spheres of life in common, understanding the context of the word's origins at the Roman Empire's inception will shed light on the psychological dimension of political choices and reveal why and how security goes beyond keeping a population safe. When vastly more people die from car crashes, but resources pour not just into protecting airplanes from terrorists, but into a theatrical apparatus of security measures, the Roman background will show that security has always turned on emotions, on imaginative attachments and their management. These affect whether individual risk or some centralized institution appears as a more legitimate bearer of responsibility. Choices about the degree of centralization and the discourses through which such choices are made, justified, or challenged reveal basic assumptions about what makes community and holds it together. The following features of Roman security remain relevant today. Beyond bodily safety, security revolves around our longing for an imagined peace that recedes from view all the quicker the more it is desired. Security mobilizes affect. Much of Roman political thought passes through non-conceptual or not fully conceptual vehicles, images and figurations, examples without explicit morals, and stories that appeal to emotion and affect attitudes or dispositions. Literature is therefore an important source for the metaphors and tropes of security. Security which trades on feelings short of or beyond reason and has as much to do with representation as objective conditions of safety. While shared longing cannot guarantee safety, it nevertheless builds community. But security comes, as always, at a price. It may hold us together, but it also drives us apart. Trade-offs in individual liberties and rights are required to ensure group preservation and may jeopardize the very foundations of group cohesion. Security obeys hierarchies. It has a strong attachment to empire, and its tendency to centralization is anti-democratic. It fosters depoliticization and dependency among citizens. Its imagined embodiment in a charismatic leader sympathizes with autocracy. Security's psychopolitical sphere is the very space of ideology. In antiquity and modernity alike, it touches on society's dearest values. It may undermine them in their own name in an act of autoimmune self-destruction. Okay, I'm first going to present some old-fashioned philological word study and highlight how the vocabulary of safety under the Republic developed greater psychological resonance with the admixture of the vocabulary of care in the transition to empire. Then I'm going to go over two clusters of tropes. The first I call embodied security. Basically, the idea is that group safety is embodied in the leader's safety. As empire emerges from the Republic's ashes, a group's dependence on a leader is conceptualized more and more as an affective attachment. The second cluster of tropes examines the depoliticization attendant on the leader's increasing monopoly on care. So the third section is by far the shortest, so if you don't despair if I seem to be running on at length, okay? Okay, so the first section is lexicographical preliminaries. So to appreciate the innovation of Securitas, we need to know what semantic territory it encroaches on. Solus is the Republican word that best corresponds to modern national security. Its basic meaning is bodily safety or health. So we get in modern Latin-derived languages, salut in French, salute in Italian, and so on. So Cato the Elder uses it of the physical integrity of soldiers facing danger, as well as the well-being fostered by the regular consumption of cabbage. Solus remains stable as a term under the empire. So although Securitas comes to occupy some of the semantic space originally covered by solus, it supplements rather than supplants it. Unlike Securitas, solus lacks an intrinsic affective component. So although solus can belong to an individual, it was also foundational for life in common. It frequently pertains to the health or safety of the state. Cicero makes it the supreme principle governing the conduct of magistrates. And for here, I think you all have a handout. This is going to be on item 1 of the handout. And so he says, let the safety of the people, salus populi, be the highest law for, and them as the magistrates. For Cicero, the doctor offers one analog among others for the statesman. Just as the doctor fosters health, so the statesman aims to ensure a happy life for his citizens. This is in item 2. For just as a favorable journey has been set before the helmsman, in the sense of set before him as his task, health, that's solus, the doctor, victory, the general, so has the blessed life, beata vita, of the citizens been set before the governor of the republic. The statesman's task is safeguarding not just the life of his fellow citizens, but the blessed life. This reaches beyond mere biological life to the good life of the body politic. Under the Republic, solus encompasses both internal and external politics and appears personified in coinage. Augury was taken for state safety, augurium salutis. In the early 4th century BCE, the Romans dedicated a temple to personified Solus on the Quirinal Hill in response to a military threat. And it's thought that the statue in the temple inspired the head, which the one on the left says salutis on it. On the other side, on the reverse, is valetudo, which is another word for health. So under the empire, the ideological role of Solus grew even stronger. As Salus Publica, she received offerings. Dedications were made to Salus Caesaris Augusti. The Republican conceptualizations of Salus persist and intensify under the empire. But when affect attaches to this ideology, it results in a new discourse, where Securitas and its cognates come to mean national security. This new discourse, oops, we need this one. Okay. This new discourse tracks a reorientation in cultural expectations of the state and the relationship of citizens to it. If solus is a feature of the body politic, Securitas becomes a feature of the soul political. Ever since Plato's analogy between the city and the soul in the Republic, the soul's condition has been available as an index of the community within political theory. Analogy informs the expansion of Securitas' semantic sphere from psychology to national security, from peace of mind, its consistent meaning in Cicero, to safety under the empire. Cicero's gloss tranquility indicates the word was not universally familiar, and some people think that he may even have invented it. This is item 3 on the handout. And he says, however, the security of Democritus, where he uses the word Securitas there, which is the tranquility of soul, animi tranquilitas, that they call contentment, in Greek that's euthymia, that is itself the blessed life. Cicero sets up, but does not join, a number of elements the new imperial order will bring together and tighten. He relates tranquility to basic animal and human drives to bodily integrity, as well as social and intellectual needs. He clarifies that Democritian, euthymia, belongs to a spirit free from fear, animum terrore liberum. Since men and animals naturally respond to danger with fear, it is a small step to make tranquility dependent not just on safety, but on its perception. Similarly, since Cicero establishes an analogy between solus and the vita beata of citizens in his book on the Republic, and here equates Securitas with the vita beata itself, he paves the way for making Securitas the basis of the collective blessed life. Once the state adopts responsibility for Securitas, Cicero's equation of tranquility with the blessed life, that is philosophy's aim, prepares for a further idea, that the state will need to provide not just protection for its citizens' material lives, but also a tranquil habit of living. Beyond the difference in orientation, solus toward the body, Securitas toward the soul, they differ essentially in their relation to the negativity that defines them. Solus is a condition of plenitude, always in opposition to an implied lurking danger. Disease may be endogenous, however, it does not arise conceptually from within health itself. By contrast, lack inhabits Securitas from within. Security instantiates Roberto Esposito's theory of immunity. He says, life can be protected from what negates it only by means of a further negation. End quote. Securitas is a state of being devoid of care. The prefix se, meaning apart, and that's the same prefix as in separate, se paratus. The noun cura, which means care, and the suffix tas, that indicates an abstract noun. Unlike tranquilitas, Cicero's dominant word for peace of mind, which turns toward the positive, Securitas bears the traces of the worry it notionally forestalls. So even in negating it, it still names worry. Lack of worry then later comes to mean safety. It is as if the Greek word for tranquility, ataraxia, a lack of disturbance in the soul, took over the semantic space of asphaleia, a lack of slipping and falling. Just imagine that the state should become responsible for philosophical ataraxia, and you'll get an idea of what Securitas is doing. The negative orientation of Securitas is further complicated by the double positive and negative meanings of the root cura, tending, like our care, when you care for something, and anxiety, as when you have cares. So both of these correspond well to the English word care. Both meanings, tending and anxiety, and both negations, carefree and careless, play important roles in Roman political discourse. Early on, care appears as a binding force. As tending, it structures social hierarchies. Parents care for children, patrons their clients, hosts their guests, the strong the vulnerable. The gods tend to mortals, just like parents. Care also directs energies toward activities that build the world across different spheres: agriculture, the military, one's own political career or a friend's, ritual practices, literature, art, scholarship, anything worth exertion. Deep in the Roman political imaginary lies the idea that the republic is an object of care. The fundamental job of the statesman is to tend the affairs, the res publica, that constitute the public realm. A particular task requiring oversight is the object of care. The cura annoni, which is the care of the grain supply, was one such political task. Today, we would call this food security. Other portfolios include basic infrastructure, water, roads, and regulation of land, property, and agriculture. The safety of the fatherland embraces all of these. In the climactic close to Cicero's De Republica, the elder Scipio recommends such care as the path to eternal reward. And this is item 4 in the handout. The best cares, curae, however, are for the safety, salute, of the fatherland. Care affects the heart. Varro etymologizes cura as a thing that burns, urat, the heart, cor. So cor, urat gives you cura. Anxiety is cura's most basic meaning. Like Hesiod's good strife, anxiety motivates people to tend to whatever they care about. Cura therefore becomes a metonym for the beloved in erotic contexts and also plays no less a political role than its sunny aspect as tending. Cicero expresses anguished love for the state during the Republic's collapse. At a certain point, he says, "Anxiety over the Republic was torturing me." The removal of anxiety from the sphere of politics becomes a positive good under an empire that vaunted its stability. Securitas became a tutelary goddess of the Roman state. The Republican coins with personified Solus find their analog under Nero, when this Dupondius was minted, sporting the personification of Securitas Augusti, the security of Augustus. And this is the coaster comes from the reverse of this coin. The emperor's tranquility becomes synonymous with the tranquility of the empire. I will now go over some passages showing how we get to this formulation. So here, around the naked lady. I don't even see her as a naked lady. All personifications in Roman coins look like this. But as you can see, it says Securitas Augusti around the edge. Okay, so second section, embodied security. Under the Republic, the safety, solace of various leaders, particularly in military situations, could be presented as necessary to the preservation of the group. We find this trope of Pompey, of Cicero, of the two together, without any implication there's only one such person. When Caesar emerges as victor from the civil wars, and sorry, this didn't expand very well. However, he becomes the sole beneficiary of such responsibility. In a speech before the Senate, Cicero thanks Caesar for clemency toward an opponent in civil war, and this is item 7 on the handout. So I'm less interested in the circumstances than in the trope of how he says it. So he says, "For who is there who does not understand that his own safety is contained within your own, and that the life of all depends on yours alone?" And then later he says, "Unless you are safe, Gaius Caesar, we cannot be safe. For this reason, all of us who want these things to be safe both exhort and beg you to look after your life, your safety. And all of us promise not only to watch and guard you, but even to put our flanks and bodies in the way of harm." We see how well that turned out. The trope now attaches to a single figure, Caesar, whose safety stands for the groups, through synecdoche as a part for the whole. Cicero comes close here to the language of tyranny. The senators act as bodyguards, Aristotle's classic example of the mark of the tyrant. But to lose Caesar would pose too great a risk, the return of civil war, and that's in fact what happened. And therefore, tyranny is accepted, however provisionally, however ironically, as safety's price. In the next generation, Virgil spells out the tyrannical implications of this trope and makes clear that the ruler's safety prevents the self-destruction that is civil war. And this is a passage from the Georgics, it's number 8 on the handout, and he's describing an allegorical society of bees. Furthermore, not to this extent does Egypt or extensive Lydia, nor thus do the peoples of Parthia or the Median Hydaspes pay court to a king. When the king is safe, the Latin is rege incolume, and I want you to remember that phrase because it's going to come back. All have a single mind. When he's been lost, they break faith and themselves rip apart the hives they have built and dissolve the framework of the honeycomb. He is the guardian of works, operum custos, and remember the custos. Him they admire, and all stand around him with thick buzzing and crowd him in a dense throng. Often they raise him on their shoulders and shield him with their bodies in war, there's the bodyguard again, and seek death glorious through wounds. Virgil's depiction of unity among the bees while their king is safe, rege incolume, recalls Cicero's topos, but it speaks to contemporary thinking about leadership and security as Rome was turning toward monarchy as a solution to civil war. The king's safety offers the unifying social glue that prevents the bees from destroying their own community. Without him, they rip apart their hives and dissolve the architecture of the honeycombs. Virgil expresses the unanimity of the bee society, the effective element that binds society together, as a psychological matter. They have a single mind. Orientalism here critiques this politics as un-Roman, but Virgil gives no hint he was thinking of Augustus, the new Caesar of his times. 15 years later, however, Horace will attach Virgil's phrase to Augustus himself and thereby make the subtle suggestion explicit. Horace links Caesar Augustus's rule to his own sense of safety in a context stressing order at Rome once Augustus sets an end to civil war. Fear for safety is now articulated in terms of the negation of care. This is cura. I want to stress this next passage because it is the first to bring together Imperial Securities' essential discursive elements. It falls under the radar of security studies people, even people who work on the political aspect of it, because conceptual historians valorize concepts over tropes and therefore neglect poetry. And they also neglect representations where the word they study is absent. And this, just for a point of methodology, is why a metaphorological approach is needed. Okay, the passage in item 9. So he says, "This day will truly drive off black cares, atras curas, for me. I will not fear tumult or to die from force with Caesar holding the lands." Horace celebrates Augustus's return from Spain in 24 BCE, a foreign expedition to shore up imperial rule. Tumult here is code for civil war, and at the poem's close, Horace in fact refers back to his own participation in civil war. He fought at Philippi with Brutus against the Caesarians. His subsequent reconciliation to Augustus is paradigmatic for calming the passions of the heart. His embrace of poetry over hot-headed politics is symptomatic of the imperial shift, where literature became a place to do politics by other means. A decade later, Horace pulls another essential element into the trope, the link between the leader's safety and the social order, described in a lush and idealized evocation of peace and a remarkable assemblage of cliches. He again celebrates Augustus's safe return from an expedition abroad with a phrase recalling Virgil's rege incolume, and this is item 10. For the cow, and this slide is well, the historical information is on here, but notice there are a number of elements on this representation, which is a prime monument of Augustan art that correspond to this passage. So for the cow, and the cow is like under the lady with the children's feet, under her feet. So for the cow, wanders the countryside in safety. Ceres and fostering good fortune, and there are also like sheaves of grain in there. So Ceres, goddess of grain, and fostering good fortune nurture the countryside. Sailors fly over the waters in peace. That means no pirates, all right? Faith fears blame. Chaste houses are fouled by no adultery. Custom and law have conquered tainted evil. New mothers, voila, receive praise for bearing children resembling their fathers. Penalty attends faults. Who would fear the Parthian? Who the frozen Scyths? Who the offspring shaggy Germany brings to birth, while Caesar Augustus is unharmed? Incolume Caesare. Who would worry, correct, about war with savage Spain? The evolution of the figuration of the leader's safety from Cicero through Virgil through Horace shows the threat of civil war decreasing over time. Although he omits any reference to civil war in this poem, Horace shows indirectly through the trope's evolution what he states explicitly at the end of the collection of poems in which this one came out, and this is on item 10. With Caesar Augustus as guardian of affairs, we get that custos word back from Virgil. Civil madness and force will not drive out peace. Horace calls Caesar a guardian of affairs, just as Virgil called the king bee the guardian of their works. He talks about the safety of Caesar with the same language that Virgil talked about the safety of the king of the bees. Under Augustus, Romans no longer need to worry about their own safety in civil war, and they can rest secure that Rome will prevail against foreign foes. Internal and external political safety have now come to be articulated in terms of the psychic state of a paradigmatic individual, the poet whose denial of personal fear, personal anxiety, stands for the collective sigh of relief. The social order now depends on the corporate body of the monarch, whose safety stands for the tranquility of the body politic. The elements of Imperial Securitas are now in place. Horace both articulates the new rhetoric and, by allusion to Virgil, reveals the new political order as an Orientalist monarchy in hiding. The solution to civil war has destroyed the Republic as or more effectively than civil war itself. Velleius Paterculus, that cheerfully blinkered supporter of Augustus and Tiberius, marshals a slogan with a bright future. The full ideology of national security appears here in its happiest guise. Velleius depicts the citizens' reaction to the news that Augustus has adopted Tiberius and made him his associate. The transition is mercifully peaceful. This is item 12. The happiness of that day and the rally of the citizen body and the hands lifted almost into heaven and the hope conceived for the perpetual security and eternity of the Roman Empire, perpetuae securitatis aeternatisque Romani imperii. Scarcely could I write about it enough in the work I plan on writing, but much less talk about it here. But okay, let's try to say this one thing, how it favored all. Then the certain hope of offspring gleamed for parents, of marriage for men, of estates for masters, for all men of safety, salutis, quiet, peace, tranquility, tranquillitatis, to such an extent that no more could be hoped for, nor answer more happily to hope. The Securitas Imperii envisioned here makes the link between tranquility and safety and names the concept. I just want to point out on this coin, which is quite a bit later, the personified Securitas is holding a globe, all right? So this is definitely like the imperial. Okay, so here the concept is finally named in this mediocre historian. All right, so to the extent that safety, peace, and quiet imply the abeyance of military threats, Velleius' Securitas resembles the salus imperii, safety of empire, Caesar mentions as its republican predecessor. And this is in item 13. So we're back, I'm giving comparative material here from a much earlier time. So Caesar attempts to conciliate Scipio, a Pompeian, who's fighting on the other side in the Civil War, by saying that if he comes over to his side, all will attribute to him alone quiet in Italy, peace in the provinces, and the safety of the empire, salutem imperii. But going back to the Velleius' security further entails more broadly the prosperous and more pointedly tranquil continuation of the social order in terms similar to those articulated by Horace. By putting Augustus's succession on sure footing, the emperor, Augustus, had enabled the citizenry to go about the business of attending to their own succession, expressed via property, marriage, and the production of heirs. The removal of a threat to imperial succession secures general prosperity. By implication, the emperor embodies the prosperity of all. The perpetuation of his house results in the perpetuation of the empire, which ensures in turn the perpetuation of their houses. The security of the empire is a matter of safety, but also of feeling, of hope, of the imaginative projection of prosperity into the future, and therefore it is a matter of representation. What goes missing here is as important as what is said. Velleius focuses on the perpetuation of the household rather than of politics as a sphere of liberty, contestation, and collective decision-making. The discursive Republican analog might look like the conclusion to Cicero's fourth Catilinarian oration. Okay, we're going back to Cicero for a moment. Which was given, the fourth Catilinarian was given when Cicero had discovered a conspiracy by Catiline against the Republic and almost single-handedly saved the state during his consulship. In return, Cicero asks for nothing but the continued memory of his consulship and for the Senate to watch over his son. Memory here is shorthand for glory, the best compensation for Republican virtue. There are many points of contact with Velleius. Cicero here calls on the empire, the army, the provinces, and the whole apparatus of provincial clientage in his plea for recognition, which he valorizes even over his own physical safety. Inheritance and preserving the next generation ensure Rome's future. Item 14 has his request to his fellow senators. He says, "But if the force of wicked men deceives and overwhelms my hope, I commend to you my small son, to whom there will be enough protection not only of his safety, but also his dignity, if you remember he's the son of one who has preserved all this at his own danger alone. Therefore make your decision with diligence and courage, as you have begun, concerning the highest safety, yours and that of the Roman people, concerning your wives and children, altars and hearths, shrines and temples, the roofs and seats of the whole city, the empire and freedom, the safety of Italy, the Republic taken in its entirety." The broader scope of Cicero's depiction of society jumps out in contrast to Velleius's. The Republican orator's picture spans the physical city, its geographic context, the monuments of religious institutions, in addition to family and home. Furthermore, Cicero refers to the decision-making capacity of the Senate, to liberty, and the dignity beyond safety of his son. These markers of Republican values are absent in Velleius. For the imperial historian, the people's concerns have shrunk. They care about public affairs only to the extent that they mirror their private affairs. The only one to make a decision is Augustus, whose succession reproduces himself and therefore the state in the next generation. Lying in the emperor's grant, general prosperity is no longer a shared object of active care. By putting anxiety under wraps, the active political sphere comprising social concerns, family, religion, and active governance has been depoliticized into a passive social sphere of family and property. This is both the benefit and the price of Securitas. The monopoly on care. The ideology of imperial security entails depoliticization. In giving up anxiety, the people also give up public action. The emperor, at least in imperial representations, takes all cares onto himself, leaving the people at leisure to enjoy in full tranquility the fruits of a peace that he secures. A host of imperial passages collected in items 15 through 19 on the handout, which I'm not going to read, but I just throw them in there to show that there are a lot of them. They show the emperor taking pains, exerting himself, denying himself rest or peace with the language of care, so as to ensure safety and benefits for others. I call your attention particularly to item 18. Nerva proclaims in an edict that I put the security, securitatem, of all above my own peace, quieti. Such statements bear superficial resemblance to Cicero's statement in his De Republica that is back in item 4 on the handout, that the best cares are for the safety of the fatherland. But there's a crucial difference. Cicero calls for action, for participation in politics. He's trying to make the task of the statesman attractive. Whereas the imperial statements send a different message. Relax, don't worry, the emperor has it all under control. With Ovid, and this is my last major body of material, the Augustan concentration of power becomes normalized, and the emperor's monopoly on care sets in place an autocratic order of security as passivity. The first and last stories about human bodily change and the metamorphoses entail security crises that threaten the political order. Their resolution confirms the power of a single dynastic leader and gives a vivid illustration of the new structure of imperial politics. In the first, a man named Lycaon attempts to murder Jupiter. And in the last, as these frame the whole metamorphoses. And in the last, Julius Caesar is actually assassinated. In both, the threat targets an absolute monarch whose bodily integrity has a synecdoche relation to world order, both cosmic and political. His safety stands for world safety in the now familiar trope. In both stories, Jupiter intervenes to secure order. When he himself is threatened, he immediately destroys the house of Lycaon, who turns into a wolf. And you might remember that Rome sort of has to do with wolves, but we're not going to underline that. Turns into a wolf. And then Jupiter also purifies the human race of Lycaon's crime by destroying all humanity in the Great Flood. Perhaps the first, but certainly not the last, overreaction to a security crisis by someone in power. When Caesar is assassinated and the resulting civil wars threaten Rome, Jupiter intervenes to assure Augustus' succession and the perpetuation of the Julian line. The threats to order elicit anxiety, cura, and the restoration of order entails a leader who shoulders cares and allows his subjects to let theirs go. The human race is miraculously restored after the flood. Augustus's rule puts an end to civil war and restores Rome under the rule of Jupiter. The parallel holds between divine and Roman order, between Jupiter and Augustus. Restoration entails an autocratic monopoly on care so the people may have security. Jupiter makes his case for humanity's destruction before a council of gods who have assembled as if coming to the Palatine Hill, which was the site of Augustus's house. He argues that he's worried now because of Lycaon's assassination attempt, as he is as worried now because of Lycaon's assassination attempt as he was during the Gigantomachy, which is in Latin literature a kind of code mythic analog for civil war. And therefore he must destroy humanity as a whole. Jupiter here is a prime example of an unreliable speaker, and there are many flaws to his argument, particularly in making the part, Lycaon, stand for the whole, all of humanity. Ovid's light but vicious wit needles the ideology at its most vulnerable points. Jupiter's argument makes evident all the essential elements of autocratic security measures. He theatrically arouses the council's anxiety and promises he will ensure safety. And then he tells them not to worry. Dismiss your anxiety, dismiss your cares. A little bit of this is on the handout. Ovid likes to tell stories at length, so I couldn't put very much of it there. But he tells them to give up their cares. Rather, he will take on all cares. Okay, and this I do want you to look at in the handout. When they ask about such things, the king of the gods forbids them to be afraid. All the rest will be his concern, Cura. Jupiter establishes a monopoly on care. This story offers a paradigm of how an autocratic leader may exploit a terrorist situation. He's already handled the discrete problem, like Aeon, before letting his constituents know of the threat. He arouses their intense worry only to dispel it. He generalizes the one situation to the whole. The decision to deploy universalizing security measures, global destruction, beyond the discrete threat, meets no resistance from his support group. Any expressed worry, he takes over as his responsibility. Jupiter manages the group's reaction by consistently bracketing others' cares. Ovid divides the gods' response to Jupiter's proposal into two groups, only to contrast not their reactions pro and con, but their relative degree of support. The deliberation over opposing views expected of a Republican Senate fizzles into passive acceptance of the autocratic leader's plan. His monopoly on care goes hand in hand with autocracy. Ovid does not quite say the same of Augustus, although he makes the analogy available. As often, the explicit articulation comes later, and this is the last item on the handout, 21. Pliny later says of the emperor that he alone, Solus, has taken on the cares, kuras, and labors of all for the common good. I conclude with two observations. You all know where the story of embodied safety goes from here. Solus comes back in Christian Latin, where it no longer means safety of the body, but salvation of the soul. Augustine rejects the philosophical and political Securitas of classical Rome as a perversion of values. Eventually, salvatio in medieval Latin will mark the difference between these words. Nevertheless, a similar structure returns in a different kind of embodiment. We call it incarnation, of a charismatic leader. Charisma comes from the Greek charis, or grace, who takes on the burdens of the collective and saves what they hold most dear. Not a political good, but rather their immortal souls. In the last century, another word, heil, combined health and salvation, secularized and repoliticized them, and again embodied them in a charismatic leader who stood notionally as part for the group's whole. As for the link between security and depoliticization, the ideology I outline is a product of Roman elites reimagining politics in reaction to their loss of power under a de facto monarchy. The difference between the Republic and the Empire has been described differently by historians. Describe it rather as the normalization of many of the chaotic aspects of politics. They're developed, for instance, a robust legal system in contrast to the Republican reliance on judgment of men who could be influenced. We also see the beginnings of what we might later call bureaucracy in Roman imperial administration. The Augustan period shows a turn toward governmentality, and with the marriage legislation, interventions in biopolitics. The internalization of social norms that is cura for the state could be called a form of discipline. Giving up cura for the Republic made time and energy available for the cura sui, the care of the self, in the developing private and aesthetic spheres. Widespread peace and the centralization of power allowed for a transformation in the public sphere from a sphere of Republican action and deliberation into one of imperial representation and communication. Beyond safety and feelings about safety, security is deeply embedded in the very structure of the political, if we conceive of the political broadly as a realm encompassing the soul, the organization of society, constitutional forms, and cosmic order. I thank you for your attention. I feel like I'm at a political rally now.
Ms. Lowrie will take questions, and as she is a professor, she will call on you herself.
Who wants to go first? Dot.
One of the questions that came to my mind, Professor, listening to you was, say, the issue of trust in your leaders. And because the whole idea, I think, of Securitas and the way it developed from the Republic to the Empire really only works if you trust your leaders to deliver. Is that right?
Yeah, so fides is a preeminent Roman value. It is, if there was any way that one wanted to translate the social bond back into Latin, it would be fides. So yeah, there has to be trust, but fides is something that governs all social relations. So yeah, this is. One could pull many other important words into this story.
That was a great lecture. Thank you so much. And as you said before, Securitas means you trust into your leaders. And I remember when I first visited the United States many years from now, there was the middle-class Americans, and they said, "President knows best." That was something, but who does say that today? And if we don't trust our leaders anymore, that means we live in very insecure times today. Thank you.
So this is, of course, a very interesting, another metaphorical transfer, because what one says, and what that is based on is "Father knows best," of course. So, yeah. I mean, that's the English phrase, so it's a nice transfer. Yes.
Thanks for the story of etymologies. Some words I was thinking of that, in this talk of Securitas, in contrast to aspaleia in Greek, which means non-slipping, I also thought of Greek equivalents for Securitas used by the great exemplum of Cicero, Demosthenes, namely ratumia. And I think, and eutimia as well, used in a different sense of naivete. Ratumia, meaning ease of mind, was used as a form of, used pejoratively. And it was to condemn the Athenians for being too easy at mind and not taking care of things. And this was said in the age when Philip of Macedon took over Athens and democracy died. I was just wondering if that, you considered that all in terms of your thesis on security being somewhat anti-democratic.
So one of the things that's really interesting is that Securitas develops a meaning in post-Augustan Latin, which is carelessness. And we get really interesting passages, particularly in Tacitus, where he's excoriating the public for their carelessness. And there are these great passages where, because they're secure, it's not that they're in a sense of calm. Rather, they just completely don't care anymore, and they bring about civil war again. So there's it's particularly with that word that we see this autoimmune function. So I mentioned Roberto Esposito, who talks about autoimmunity in the political, and there have been various people, Derrida, recently, John Hamilton has written a book on sort of the philology of security, who've emphasized this aspect of carelessness. I haven't actually gone back to the Greek material. It would be a great thing to do. It would be very interesting, but I have more than enough material for my project on the Roman side of things, and one has to limit things somewhere. Hari.
Something you just mentioned in passing at the end, the idea that the transfer of cura to the imperial ruler, the sort of the cares of state, opens up in some way a space for the private sphere. I mean, do you see that as necessary for the evolution of a notion of privacy?
Oh. I don't think that's necessary. I think that historically one can say that that's how it evolved within this particular discourse. So what I was referring there in somewhat coded language was to Foucault's to two sets of works. One is his History of Sexuality, and the third volume of which he makes this period of transition to the empire a very central part of the development of a sense of an internal private self that one can cultivate. And he's been critiqued by a number of people. I nevertheless think that he had a really good instinct about how that was working. On the other hand, he talks about security in his lectures on security, territory, and population, where he makes a kind of shift. You think he's going to talk about security, and he doesn't. He makes a shift towards governmentality. And so the work that I'm doing is somewhere in the space between those two sets of lectures. But no, I think there are possibilities for privacy and under better political conditions. I mean, but that's just, if you're asking me personally, I hope so. In the back, yeah.
For the kinds of developments you were talking about, you had two stories going on. One was the fear of internal division, and the other was sort of the external threat. Mm-hmm. Is there a balance there, or would you say that one or the other seem to be more driving of the kinds of discursive changes you were looking at?
The discursive change that I'm tracking is definitely a response to civil war. So the Cicero turns to writing philosophy at times when he's out of power, and he's out of power because of the civil wars. So just the very actual context of his thinking about tranquility and peace of mind is a kind of self-care for him. He's doing philosophy in ways that he talks about as being supplemental, or actually substitutive for politics. When he can't do politics, he does philosophy, and you can see that he has a very practical orientation always to his philosophy. So his attempt to develop or to cultivate some kind of tranquility is directly as a result of the civil wars. In early Augustan literature, you get the trope again and again that we Romans should turn our violence towards others because otherwise we'll turn it towards ourselves. So, I think it should be clear, but I just want to emphasize it. What I'm talking about are discourses. I'm not talking about any type of objective security. I mean, I hope that that's clear. But the discourse comes about as a result of civil war tearing the state apart, and then foreign war, which the Romans always engaged in, because imperial expansion is what you do if you have virtue, which is the prime Republican value, and that's just what virtue leads to. It leads to imperial expansion. The problem is that there's a kind of autoimmune reaction, which is that imperial expansion brings back all kinds of vices from luxury, and it corrupts the soul, and then when the soul corrupts, then the state falls apart, and then the next generation then sees further imperial expansion as being a solution to the problems of civil war. Steve. Okay,
Michèle,
Gerhard. Yeah.
Thank you for a great lecture. Wonderful. In contemporary times, we still associate security with leaders, autocratic leaders, dictators. You suggested, you ever so subtly alluded to Hitler. And in that sense, we personalize it. But in democracies, we don't personalize it. We talk about state security. And it is not only the security of the state, but the state is supposedly providing the security. And my question is, in Roman times, was the notion of Securitas ever institutionalized? That is, not personalized, not attached to the notion of the Caesar, but to the institutions of the Republic and then later perhaps the Empire.
So it's not a Republican political concept. I mean, that is perhaps the one point I want people to come away with. Above all, it is not Republican. And so it only comes about when there is somebody to attach it to as a person. So in terms of the question of institutionalization, that's always a very complicated question for Rome, because Rome didn't have institutions the way we think of institutions. I mean, they have things that later will become institutions. I mean, there was no police force, there was no prison system. You know, if you they start to develop a robust sense of, or you know, a robust body of law, but this actually takes centuries to develop, and it's just very different thing. All politics was more personalized. So under the empire, you know, the emperor would give a particular person the charge of taking care of the water supply or the food supply. And then that became very associated with the person. All politics was more personalized than anything we can imagine today, even under the Republic. If anything, under the Republic, it was even more so, because they were all big men trying to play in the public sphere and trying to preserve face, and you know, that's what politics was about. It was always a show. So one of the things that I find fascinating in comparing, say, you know, democracies to more, you know, autocratic forms, is that we still nevertheless get certain types of metaphorological transfers. So instead of having an oath to, say, a Roman general, or an oath to a Roman emperor, or an oath to a modern dictator, what Americans have is the Pledge of Allegiance, where there's an oath to the flag, and German mothers with kids in the American school system freak out over this thing precisely because they know that in the history of the oath-taking, it tends to be towards persons. So the flag is a typical American transfer.
And for the Republic
to which it's the Republic for which it's, yeah. No, the flag is always like the symbol, you know, of the Republic.
It was only introduced again after 9/11. Yeah? It wasn't there.
Oh, yes.
I said the Pledge of Allegiance when I was a child, every day. Well, decadence. And also, you should know that in America, there's a big difference between public and private schools. In private schools, they typically do not say the Pledge of Allegiance. And they tried to bring it into my son's school, and all the German mothers revolted. It was, it was hilarious. But I think Steve had a question.
And on the discourse that you're speaking about, and the evolution of the use of Securitas, I'm wondering how much of it was, you know, drawing from the family structure, where the paterfamilias family structure, you know, the Securitas was dependent on the male head of family, and did that translate very easily, when the time was right historically, into the male head of state? Is that
Absolutely, yeah. So the first person, not quite that. So in this language, let me get rid of the first person. A person who early gets the appellation pater patriae, which means father of the fatherland, is Cicero. And this then becomes an honor that Augustus is given. And then, you know, afterwards, you know, if you're emperor, you just become the father of the fatherland. So it's a very patriarchal system.
and that began in the Republic, right? So I mean,
Oh, yes, that's a Republican.
So that thread was laid there, and I wonder how much of it is the drift of sort of a small society to a mass society. And suddenly when you have mass societies, you have to start for institutional integrity, you have to start assigning values to, if not the institution, the people that run the institutions, if not both. So perhaps this is part of the drift as Rome became bigger. It just simply needed a new discourse that would take the family and move it to the nation kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things one could say.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Well, just a quick follow-up, if I
Yeah.
may. I mean, if you think about how we use security today, of course, it's national security, but you also use it for social security.
Right.
You use it for income security. And so security has this connotation today that is quite broad. And so as the discourse developed in Rome, was there any kind of, that sort of trailing language where the security started meaning different components, household security, national security, income security, I mean, anything of this nature?
We don't get that kind of development. But what you do get are things like that with the word cura, and that you have even under the Republic. So the care of the grain supply, there was a guy who had the cura annoni. There was a guy who had the care of the water, who had the care. So it happens with the word cura. I mean, a lot of times, if you're doing conceptual history, you'll find that not all aspects of the discourse move forward at the same rate or at the same time.
Right.
So one of the things that I think is really fascinating now is how this word can be applied to virtually anything. It's not just mentioned, but it's internet security. I mean, and so what I would like to emphasize there is that that's also a metaphorical transfer, and that we should be aware when we're using metaphors. Not that I want to hold to either etymologies or the proper sphere as the legitimate sphere of meaning, but I think it's very important for us to know at what point we're taking a word or a concept or a cluster of tropes and moving it from one area to the other, because then I think it reveals what people care about. I mean, it reveals what matters, because you wouldn't reach for this discourse over here and pull it over to that if there weren't some drag.
Right.
So when you see those metaphorological transfers happening, that is a sign that something really important is happening in the culture.
Yeah, I mean, they often come in response to a crisis of some kind.
Yeah.
And so, during time of crisis, you reach around for what you already know as a solution or a language or a discourse.
And I think that here again, I'm speaking as opposed
This
to
is like
describing.
being at breakfast.
Yeah, but I think when you take language that was formulated for one context and pull it over to the other context, you need to be very careful, because you might be bringing parts of the previous context that may not be necessarily very helpful in the new context. And so if that comes over, there are assumptions that happen. If you start talking about contemporary events in mythic terms, there are going to be a host of unarticulated assumptions that come along with it, which people respond to as if they're just natural, and they're not.
Right. Yeah, the word welfare is a good example of that.
Okay, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Following up on what has just been said, I wonder if it's really just or only metaphorical, this kind of pluralization of securities, or maybe what is at the origin of the whole story. So I think you mentioned at the outset that it's mainly a psychological issue, and that could be what's happening today, right? So it's a very private, individual thing. Many of us care a lot, I think, about being sine cura. So maybe it's, to phrase it as a question, what do we see when we trace today's security issues back to the imperial history, and what is maybe what is left out of sight?
So what's left out of sight is the fact that this concept and this word has to do not just with ensuring a population's safety, which is what we assume it means today. But it has to do with keeping the population tranquil. So it means that the state is intervening in people's emotions so as to produce a certain kind of result. And the story of my Roman text suggests that that is keeping activism and participation and speech and opposition to the government down for the purpose of whatever the government's program is to bring about safety. And some people might disagree. And we have to remember that that in this word, hidden, because people don't look back far enough into the meanings of words, there is inscribed into it a manipulative aspect. Yeah.
One last question, sorry.
One last.
Thank you. I
saw you raising your hand. And
no. I was just comparing some of the dates here. I guess Horace in 13 before the Common Era talked about who had to worry about those shaggy Germans to the north. And then 20 years after that was the Varusschlacht and the loss of 2 legions. And so what impact did that crisis, I know that reputedly Augustus banged his head against the wall for 2 days or something like that, but did that have that absence of, would that imply a lack of security? Had he breached the faith that they had built in him at that point?
Oh yes, absolutely. This was, this was a problem for Augustus, and it meant that the borders of empire were not secure. Kind of poets writing about this who would kind of take the lid off of the ideology. I mean, we get accounts later. So unfortunately, we just don't have any contemporary accounts for that period. But Tacitus, if you want to go and read Tacitus's account, he is scathing as usual.
Thank you very, very much.